Hi, my name is Lisa Spalding. I'm a partner at the Philanthropic Initiative, TPI, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this discussion on climate change funding at the Innovations in International Philanthropy Symposium. I'm so happy to be able to welcome my friends and teammates in philanthropy, Rod Womer and Barbara Karplus, who are founders and directors of the Woka Foundation, to share a bit about their story in climate funding so far. So Rod and Barbara, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today. I want to jump right in and talk about how this all started for you. You established the Woka Foundation to focus 100% on climate change funding. Can you tell us a little bit more about how and why you made such a bold decision, and then how you started learning about this space and carving out your own focus areas?
Okay, well, we had some investments that had done very well, and so we knew that we wanted to someday establish a foundation. But in 2018, when the IPCC report came out, that struck us as a call to action. At that point, we said, we can't wait for someday. Action needs to be taken now. So we set a goal for us to establish our foundation in 2019, and then to give our first grant in 2020. So in 2019, we interviewed 22 individuals in the philanthropic and climate spaces. And the reason we did that is we wanted to know where we should play. If we're going to try to do something, where would be the best place to be? So we were looking for funding gaps. We were looking for places that if you funded in those gaps, there was potentially large impacts to be made. And thirdly, we were looking for areas that actually interested us. We wanted to be interested in what we were going to be doing.
Right. So through these 22 interviews, and we started out with people we knew, and we would always ask, who else should we talk to? We were recommended to read an article called The Investment Gap That Threatens the Planet, about the funding gaps in scientific innovation, how when clean tech startups were trying to get started, they couldn't make it to their venture capital stage. And so scientific innovation support is one of our focus areas. We were also looking at sequestration, and we thought about, do we want our world to be full of these big fans that pull carbon out of the air, or would we rather have sequestration being part of the natural cycle of bringing carbon into plants and into the soil? And so we decided we'd rather live in that kind of a green world than one with a bunch of technology pulling carbon out of the air. So regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions are like our sequestration focus area. And then reading the book Drawdown about different strategies to deal with climate change, talked a lot about girls and women. And it turns out when girls are educated and all genders are involved in household decisions, as well as community and national decision making, decisions are made that are more beneficial to the environment and to society. So gender equity is one of our focus areas. And then education, we need to affect the public understanding of the issues involved in climate change and appreciation of our connectedness to nature, to set up education where people really develop a connection and appreciation of the world around us, which is going to make them more prone to wanting to preserve the biodiversity and life on Earth that we'd like to see.
Wow, that's incredible. So scientific innovation, regenerative agriculture and other nature-based solutions for carbon sequestration, gender equity, and education are the four pillars. And I love how you're weaving in some resources that helped inform you. You mentioned an article in the book, and we can actually share those resources as well in the discussion. So we've talked about the focus areas. Let's talk a bit about the geography. Climate is an enormous global issue, and Woka's funding spans multiple continents. And I'm wondering, how have you chosen where to target your funding geographically?
So our focus is globally. We don't normally target specific geographical areas. but we try to have a variety. So if we have some grants in one geographical area, we're looking more positively for grantees in other areas. But basically, we're looking for organizations doing good work in our focus areas, realizing again that we want to have a global presence.
Right. And so it turns out that some of our focus areas are more naturally inclined to international work. So we have many organizations that we support under our regenerative agriculture focus and under our gender equity focus. But even in the innovation focus area and the education focus area, we've got an international organization in each of those areas that we think is doing super fabulous work. So in all four of our focus areas, we've been able to find organizations that are doing great work in the international field also.
Excellent. I'd love to take a moment and talk about risk. So the Woka Foundation, from my observation, makes some big investments and takes well-informed risks. And I'm really interested to hear you share and talk about why you've embraced this kind of funding approach. Because big bets and big risks are not necessarily the norm for your average new family foundation, at least in my experience. So can you tell us a little bit about how you think about taking and managing risk when you're thinking about climate change philanthropy?
Okay, sure. To start with, when we look at climate change, the two things that strike us the most are that climate change is super complex. And there's not much time left. It's a very short time frame to get it right. And so when we take those two things into account, that tells us that we naturally have to take some risk, because if it's complex because we don't have all the answers. So if we're going to be successful, there has to be some risk involved. But that doesn't mean all risk is acceptable, that you just go forward and do any old thing that comes along. You have to manage your risk. And one of the things that we use in terms of how much risk should we tolerate is we take a look at what's the potential impact for improvement or mitigation for climate change. The larger the impact, the more risk we're willing to accept.
Right. So one example of a somewhat risky grant we made and is the International Biochar Initiative. So biochar is one of the currently scalable sequestration strategies. And but we wanted to work internationally. So there's an international biochar organization, I'm going to call it IBI. And we looked at their history of 990s, and they had funding up to about 212, 213. Then they lost their funding. They've been working basically on volunteer staff since then. And, you know, why was that? We wanted them to be a robust organization. And so we did an extra layer of due diligence. We interviewed people in the biochar space that were not affiliated with IBI. We had a multi-year grant, and we structured it with annual milestones. So every year we would know that they would have to accomplish this before they were able to release the funds for the next year. We structured the grant with a ramp up time and a ramp down time so that they were forced to get other diverse funding.
Yeah. And then one of the other things that we think about when we're thinking about risk is how well does the grantee understand the risk? And so if the grantee understands the risk that's being taken, that goes a long way towards mitigating that risk. And also, sort of, this runs across all of our grantees. What's the grantee's attitude? Is it all about them, or is it all about the people they're serving? And the grantee that walks in with the right attitude and understands the risk that they're undertaking makes us feel like we can go forward with that grantee in a little more risky situation than we would otherwise.
Wow, thank you for sharing all that nuance about it, because there really is a lot of subtlety involved. And I think it becomes best illustrated when you talk about examples. So thanks for the biochar example. And you have a lot of examples when I think across your various international grantee partners. And I just want to invite you maybe to share a few highlights about some of the initiatives that you're particularly excited about.
All right. Well, one of the grantees is called New Energy Nexus, and they have this grand vision of 100% clean energy for 100% of the population of the globe. And what they do is they support local entrepreneurs, so people working in the community from the community, which is something that we definitely look for. And those local entrepreneurs are scaling clean, renewable energy products in developing countries. So they're supporting that dissemination of renewable energy globally, and we're really excited about that initiative.
Okay. And another organization that's under our gender equity focus is Global Green Grants Fund. And what we like about them is that they reach so many grassroots, gender-centric organizations around the world. In 2020, they made over 900 grants in 99 different countries. So they're reaching out to lots of people that we would never be able to get to, except that we can through them. And they help organizations like a women's-led organization in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that's working to combat deforestation through sustainable forest management and agroforestry right there in their local community. So the great organizations that they're working with. And then the last organization we'd like to highlight is the Climate Foundation. And this is under our regenerative ag focus area, but it's not on land-based, it's ocean-based. So it's regenerative ag in the ocean. And when you do that, they call it marine permaculture. And so Climate Foundation is planning to build marine permaculture arrays that use upwelling of nutrient-rich waters from deep in the ocean to grow seaweed and then support the fish colonies that just naturally congregate around seaweed growth in tropical ocean areas. And at the same time, they will wind up sequestering significant amounts of carbon dioxide in the ocean floor from some of the seaweed that falls down to the bottom of the ocean. So they're currently demoing a 100 square meter array. Next year, they'll demo a 1,000 square meter array. And then they're planning in 2023 to construct a hectare-sized array that would be capable of providing sustainable livelihood for ocean rim communities via this seaweed and fish colonies.
Wow, I'm glad I asked. Thank you for sharing those examples. And I know there are many more. The last question I'd love to ask you is, there's such, as you've described, there's such a broad range of potential, possible, compelling climate solutions. And there's a lot of debate or discussion about where philanthropy is best invested in these space, and always some concerns about, whether some mitigation measures might also have unforeseen negative impacts. So I'm just wondering, how does Woka think about this? How do you think about where philanthropy should focus or where it has a role? And also which solutions should be funded and explored?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. I would say our go-to answer about where should you explore would be our 4 focus areas. We spend a lot of time and we think those are really valuable focus areas, but we realize those aren't the right focus areas for every organization and everybody that's operating. We also realize even with those focus areas, we come up against some hard decisions against people that are doing things that we think might not be the right idea. For example, we were invited by a close ally to be involved in an initiative that had a media component, and which would have fit really nicely into our education focus area. But it turned out that one of the partners in that media initiative was the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is an organization that is comprised of all of the big oil companies. And while some of the things they're doing in that initiative are beneficial, we are dubious of the actual intent behind that organization. And so we decided not to participate in that particular media initiative. On sort of the opposite end of that spectrum, we have a grantee that we had been supporting, but we stopped our support when we discovered that they were labeling practices that we think are very valuable, such as climate smart agriculture and reducing emissions from deforestation, as practices that is harmful to the environment, as opposed to the practices that that particular organization was taking care of. So those are just two examples of places where we decided not to play. And Barbara will talk about how we make those kind of decisions when we have to.
Yeah, so we do a lot of our own reading and research and talking to our mentors and advisors. We also locate, for example, the biochar. There's ways to use biochar that are actually harmful to the environment, and there are ways that are very beneficial and sequester carbon. And so is the organization that we're trying to support aware of the beneficial and detrimental ways that biochar are used? So we really look into that, and we try to talk to a lot of niche experts if we need to figure out the dichotomy, and we'll check with our advisors. Have you heard anything negative about this? And then make sure that the organization we're looking at looks at it from what we would consider a beneficial perspective. One important thing, we always look for organizations that involve local and affected people in a meaningful way, because if you're imposing solutions from outside, from a different culture or a different perspective, sometimes or oftentimes those solutions aren't durable. Maybe you'll make a short-term change in the local community, but it's not durable. So people looking internationally to be working in areas that are different culturally than they are from, you have to be, we recommend being on the lookout for organizations that value the opinions and indigenous knowledge of the people, the community that's there. And we always think it's important to remember it's going to take a wide array of solutions to solve climate change. So keep an open mind.
Excellent. You know, the next question, I feel like we've already started this part of the conversation, just asking you to share a few things that you've learned over the last 2 years. So I want to invite you. What else would you want to share with folks about what you've learned in this very fast ramp up of the Woka Foundation in this space?
So I think one of the things we learned is that it's really helped your perspective if you can imagine yourself as the grantee rather than as the grantor. As the grantee, you might have a different perspective. And a good example for this is Prime Coalition, which is one of our innovation organizations we support. They help clean tech startups be successful. They were putting together their Prime Impact Fund that would help fund these clean tech startups. And we thought that would be an important thing to do, but it turned out that their Prime Impact Fund was oversubscribed and it was going to close early. And if we wanted to be involved in it, we had to get our money to them right away. But then we continued our conversations with them, and what we discovered was general operating funds to support the infrastructure that's sitting behind this impact fund. They were having a hard time getting those general operating funds fulfilled. And so we decided instead to give them, because we said if we were the grantee, what would we want? And what their need was general operating funds. So we gave them unrestricted general operating funds just to run the organization so that they could actually use this impact fund that people were giving them money for in an appropriate way. That's one example. Another that's a little bit related to that is, I call it, we try to be alert to the breadcrumbs that we think we find the grantees dropping along the way. And usually they're being dropped unconsciously, not purposely. And a good example with that was we had a proposal from Green America about a regenerative agriculture initiative that they were running. And in our proposals, there's always a section that we ask questions about risks and challenges. And in the risk and challenges section, they talked about scaling while building a financial base for the initiative. So we sort of probed that with them and asked a question about, well, what does that mean to build a financial base while you're scaling? And what it turned out was they had big plans for scaling, but they knew those were going to take big dollars. And so we, in talking back and forth with them, we decided, looking at it from their point of view, that we were going to increase the amount of our grant. And by doing that, we allowed them to build to scale quicker. And so that turned out to be a really win-win for everybody.
Right, and another thing is what we call dogged tenacity. So an example, we have all the proposals from a grant cycle. And the evaluators all write down the questions, and we meet to go through the question to decide which questions to ask and which questions do we not really need to know the answers to. And it's a very complex, frustrating task. And what we tell ourselves, sometimes we just say, oh, this is too hard. But we tell ourselves in the past, we've just plodded along, taking the next step, time after time, day after day, you know, task through task, just keep on going. And in the end, the answers we receive to these questions that we've discussed are always great answers and shed important information on the light of the operations of each organizations to us. But when we're in the middle of parsing all those questions out, it's like, it's really hard, but just keep on moving.
And just to reflect on that, we certainly think asking questions is important, but the point that happens in lots of other ways for us, this dogged tenacity. Our point is, if you're really doing this right, there's going to be times where you feel like you're banging your head against the wall, and just bang one or two more times and you'll get there.
I love that answer. Dogged tenacity. It's a really good T-shirt, maybe for the Woka Foundation and hopefully for philanthropy overall. And I think that also those questions that you're asking opens up conversations with your partners that increase transparency and trust, and probably lay a firmer foundation for your relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about where we're going. I mean, where would you like Woka to be in 5 years, or what would you be proud of?
Well, 5 years from now, I'd like to see the IPCC report come out that says the prospects for limiting the worst effects of climate change are significantly better than they were when we, the IPCC, released our report back in August of 2021.
Right, and we'd be proud if some of our grantees played roles in developing and scaling the solutions that help create those improved prospects. So I think that's what we're looking for.
It's a pretty laser-like focus. Thanks for sharing that. So finally, do you have any further advice for any other types of funders who are still trying to figure out how to make a difference on an issue that is so meta, like climate, and they aren't sure where to start, and thinking especially about those that would like to do this work internationally?
So I think I would say read as much as you can and talk to people that you know that are playing in that space. And every person you talk to, ask them, who else should you talk to? And by doing that, you'll get led to people that you don't know, and they'll introduce you to those people. And building your network is super important. You're going to meet people in your early conversations that you will return back to over and over again. And the other thing that I might inject is that don't be afraid to try unlikely avenues. We at one point filled out the info at request on the contact page of Ashoka's main website, because we think Ashoka does fantastic work with entrepreneurs throughout the world. And after a couple emails back and forth, we wound up on a Zoom call with the CEO and founder of Ashoka, Bill Drayton, and we actually correspond with him on a fairly semi-regular basis and has become a close ally of ours. And so don't be afraid to try something that's a little bit out of the ordinary.
And then you're welcome to contact us. So based on your interest areas, where it's possible that we could suggest some organizations for you to speak with or places to look into. You could bounce some ideas off of us if you want to. We could have a conversation and we'd be happy to do that.
Yes, of course.
Well, that's a wonderful final set of advice and a really wonderful invitation. Thank you, Rod. Thank you, Barbara, for sharing your path so far and for your willingness to connect with others and support them along their own paths in this space. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Lisa.